one problem with the type of approach that we're taking here is that it's very liable to be dismissed as being philosophical, as being airy-fairy in some way, as opposed to being properly hard-nosed, scientific. It straight away sounds as if it belongs to that kind of philosophical way of talking about things or thinking about things. And in the West, that doesn't tend to impress us because our cultural bias is towards devaluing anything like that or dismissing anything like that as being hocus pocus, really. Hocus pocus in as much as it doesn't help us in any practical way. And we like stuff that is helpful in a practical way, stuff that impinges on our lives in a way that we can say that, well, this is a useful thing, or here's a useful thing. So if someone invents a useful thing that helps us to go faster or to do something faster or to do anything really in a simplified and more efficient way, we think that's great. But obviously that's not what philosophy does. Philosophy isn't about finding better ways of solving practical problems. And it shouldn't be. I mean, because the thing about finding better ways to solve practical problems is that when we get hooked into this, that makes us to be unconscious in a psychological sense. We get unconscious because straight away we're focused on the thing that we want to do, and we're focused on the how it is that we're going to do it, and we lose sight of why the hell would we want to do it in the first place. And that's the why. That's the what I'd call the philosophical side of things, as opposed to the practical how side of things. The how side of things can be difficult. It can be really hard to figure out the how for stuff. It can be really, really hard. But it's not as hard as the why stuff. The why stuff is not just hard, it brings us in touch with the central enigma of existence, or the central existential challenge of existence. And that's not a practical thing. There's no practical hints about how we can go about squaring off with the existential challenge of existence. No one can give us tips about that, and we can't. It's something we have to come up against ourselves on our own. Every time it has to be ourselves on our own. And it's not so much that we can find an answer then, but it's just through the process of coming up against it that we learn that we don't need an answer, and that talking about answers is missing the point entirely. So that's one thing we might learn. And I don't mean that in a despairing way, like, oh no, what's the point? I can't solve this problem. I mean in a much more liberating sense, where we realize that we don't need to treat existence as a problem to be solved or worked out. And we realize that when we try to do that, we're actually defeating ourselves, really. Because what we're doing when we try to do that, we're handing power to the rational mind the whole time, and the rational mind isn't a good thing to hand power over to. When it comes down to it, the task or the struggle in life is to free ourselves from the rational mind and its conditioning, because that's the prison we're in. And when we start trying to work out practical solutions to problems and things, even though we need to do that, if we think that is all that life is about, we're just imprisoning ourselves more and more and more the whole time, out of our practicalness, because we think life is a how thing, a practical thing. And there's no doubt that our culture, particularly at this point in time, is obsessed with the how. it's like the notion of a life hack, that there's supposed to be this thing called a life hack, a more efficient, easy way of solving life. And we kind of we're so dopey, really. It never occurs to us that life isn't supposed to be something we can easily solve and make less messy. And that this really is dopey, because suppose we go along with that and we say, okay, here's a life hack, solve all the big imponderable difficulties and all the messiness of it, solve it. But then we never think ahead. Well, what do you do when you've solved life? What exactly are you going to do then? Do you know, it's kind of we think that life is a difficulty to be dealt with or fixed so that we can then get on with doing something, enjoying ourselves or having a laugh or something, or whatever the hell it is. Basically, what it means is we don't like the challenge. We will accept the challenge to a certain point if we think that by applying ourselves to the challenge we can fix it, and then get on to what we really want to do, which is be free from any existential challenge when it comes down to it. That's what we're really aiming for. We want to be free from existential challenge, which really comes down to free to carry on in an unreflective or unquestioning way, which is exactly what is meant by the state of psychological unconsciousness, to just go along in a perfectly unreflective state, never questioning anything, and not bothering your head with looking any deeper into things at all. So that's what we really want, and that's what life hacks are about. They're to enable us to navigate the tricky bits of life and get back into the good old unreflective mode, which we love so much, even though there's no good reason to love it, because it inevitably ends in disaster, and then at that point we won't be feeling so great. But we don't think of it that way. We don't really look into it that much. So to get back to my original point, the thing is that any talk about the endless current that is taking us away from the world of the known, it just sounds like so much moonshine to us, or it tends to. We don't think it's practical. We kind of say, well, yeah, okay, but what about real life? As if real life is something else, something apart from noticing that there is this endless current taking us away from the known. So then you'd wonder, well, what the hell is this supposed real life about, if it's not about that? Can't be about very much, really, can it? And of course, if we were to object to this type of approach or this type of talk in that way, then all we'd have to do to kind of really understand it is just pay attention to ourselves in whatever situation we're in, and just notice what it feels like to be there in whatever situation we might happen to be in. So, for example, I'd sit here, as I am sitting, in the passenger seat of the car, in the car park of the Lord Lucan, and I would notice what it feels like to be sitting here. What does it come down to, this thing about sitting here in the passenger seat of the car in the car park? That's very, very practical. You couldn't get more practical than that. I'm not entertaining hypotheses or projections about what could happen or what might happen or what should happen. I'm actually getting down to the real super nitty-gritty of, well, what is this? What is going on right here? So suppose that I was interested, which is a big suppose, but we will suppose it. So I sit here and I notice. Now, it is hard to notice stuff because my mind will keep distracting me with this and that, all these hypotheticals, and it will keep going off at tangents the whole time. But if I am serious and I really do want to pay attention to what this is, what it involves, what it means to be sitting here, then I'll learn not to be distracted by my thoughts so much, and I'll pay attention. I'll pay actual attention to the matter at hand instead of paying attention to all the stuff my thoughts keep telling me, or they take me on journeys here or there to say, look, I want to show you this, look, I want to show you that. And for all of us, every single one of us, our entire lives, thought is knocking on the door and it's saying, hey, I want to show you this. And that happens all the time. Who knows how many times in a minute, how many times in an hour. But the thing to remember is that every time thought does that, it's all a hoax, because it hasn't really got anything to show us anyway. It's just all clickbait. The thought has got nothing to show us that is in any way interesting. If you wanted to know something interesting, it's not by running off or jumping on the bus that thought wants us to jump on. It's staying here and noticing what it is like to be here without thinking about what it is like to be here, which sounds simple, and it is simple, but it's also something that proves to be hard to do. But anyway, no matter how hard it might prove to be, what we do notice is that we seem to be in a known situation. I seem to be in this known situation where I'm sitting, which is a known kind of thing. I know what it means to sit in a passenger seat of a car. I know what that is. In a car park, I certainly know what that is, etc., etc. So all that is the domain of the known, and I know it. We all know it. We can also think of the domain of the known as the prison of the known, precisely because we know it so much that we can never see beyond it. So then, to carry on with the example, if I'm sitting here noticing what it actually means to be sitting here, and I'm bringing my attention to bear on the reality of the situation, not my thoughts about the reality of the situation, what happens is I notice there is this current. And anybody who does this, anyone who pays attention to what it actually means to be in whatever situation they're in, will notice that to start off with, there is the domain of the known which we navigate by, and that tells me, yes, I'm in the domain of the known, and I'm in this specific compartment of the domain of the known, so I know what compartment I'm in, which is fine. It's like, oh yeah, we're very casual about that because we always navigate with our thinking mind in this way to tell us where we are. And then I notice incongruously at the same time there is this drift or this pull or this movement taking me away from the equilibrium zone of the known. And as it takes me away, the world of the known dwindles. It becomes a small dwindling thing. And there's something else there in the picture which is actually what's really going on, as opposed to my ideas about what's going on. And so that's what's really interesting. My own ideas about what's going on is not interesting. I know it well already, and chances are I'll carry on knowing it until I die. And to add insult to injury, what I know to be going on and what I know to be true isn't true anyway, and it never was. It's just a convenient kind of label that I was happy to stick at because I didn't want to go into it too deeply, because I didn't want to find out that there is more to existence than I thought there was, that there is more to life, or more to my life, or more to who I think I am than I think there is. Because then it's like that particular type of change, that particular type of movement where we transcend everything we know or think we know, is simultaneously the most fascinating and interesting thing in the world and the most terrifying, because obviously we have to let go of this reassuring, comfortable image that we have of ourselves or of the world, or we have to let go of the label, basically. Because I'm sitting there looking at the label, I'm thinking, yeah, that's okay. It's a generic label. There's no depth to it at all. It's just a label. And then I realize the label doesn't apply to anything. It has no bearing on reality whatsoever. And that's like, wow, that's when the label dwindles and becomes like nothing. It becomes a nothingness. It just dwindles away into the distance, and it gets enveloped with reality itself. So that experience is always going on, no matter wherever we notice what's happening with us. We're always apparently in the domain of the known, but really we're in this endless current. And the thing about that is, of course, that we don't genuinely notice it because we make very sure not to notice anything about the endless current, which is the same thing as endless. What Krishnamurti calls endless, the endless current, is the same thing as David Bohm's holo movement, which is a movement where everything is moving and there's nothing that isn't moving, and so there's nothing to measure the movement by or put it in any type of context. And even though that is an extraordinarily fascinating thing, as I've said, it's also very, very challenging, because to take any notice of it at all means that we have to let go of who we think we are and who we think the world is. And we're very, very, very attached. It means we have to drop the game we're playing. And it's like, I really, really don't want to drop this game. I'm invested in it. I really, really want to play this game. And now here's something coming along that's showing me that the game is just some kind of stupid game that I'm playing in order to distract myself from reality. And I really, really don't want to know that. So here straight away we can see that when people say philosophy isn't practical, it's the most practical thing there is. And what we normally do, all of us, throughout the whole of society, what everyone is doing is playing the game and ignoring the only interesting thing about life, which is what life is. The game isn't life, even though it aggressively contains us and pretends to be life. And that's supposed to be hard-headed, and that's supposed to be the serious business that is really important in life. So what we're really saying is that the serious business that's really important in life is to avoid life. So that just is to illustrate the pure contradictoriness of everyday existence. And it also illustrates why we shouldn't listen to people, even the people that we're supposed to listen to, because they supposedly know something, because they don't. Doesn't matter who you're talking about. None of them are worth listening to, because they have no interest in the actual movement of reality. They only have an interest in our static picture of reality, which has no actual relevance to reality. So it might be argued that all of this might be fine. Maybe it's okay, it's fine, but what's it got to do with psychology or therapy? Because it sounds like what we're talking about is way bigger than just psychology and just therapy, which obviously it is. The unending current that Krishnamurti speaks of is everything, which is, of course, way bigger than any compartmentalization or discipline we might want to think about. All of them come out of it. But at the same time, what we're talking about is psychologically relevant, and relevant from a therapy point of view. Because what we're really talking about, and if we're going to address ourselves to the human situation as such as it is, which is us as human beings in total denial of what underlying reality of our situation is, then as soon as we look at that, what we're looking at is our resistance to the unending current. And it is the resistance, our resistance to the unending current, that creates this world that we're in. And it creates, more than that, it creates the self. So our resistance to the unending current creates the self. That's how the self comes into being. So that's psychological stuff. May not sound very orthodox, but it's psychological stuff. It's hard for us to digest because we think of the self as being an entity, a thing. But what the self really is not an entity, but a loop. The self is a loop, a kind of logic loop or information loop, in the sense that there is this activity whereby we pick an equilibrium point, or we pick what we say is normal, and then we work hard at maintaining it, or we work hard at interpreting everything that happens in terms of the viewpoint which we've picked, the arbitrary, extremely limited, non-representative viewpoint. We pick it, and then we kind of have this thing going on whereby if we can get our perceptions of reality to perfectly match the viewpoint, that seems to be the best thing in the world. So from an existential point of view, this little game we're playing, we're trying to get reality to match up with our idea for it, or our assumptions for it. And the whole of life is us bending stuff or spinning stuff to fit with our preconceptions. And so that's a loop, because when we bend stuff or spin it to fit the way we have assumed is the right way to see stuff, then that validates and confirms the way that we have assumed as being the right way to see stuff, and makes it more real. And then this is an ongoing process. By continually striving in an unconscious way, because we don't know we're doing this, to make actual equal expected. We have our expectations and we want everything to accord with those expectations. When we do, we feel great, of course. Everyone likes it when they're proved right or when they control successfully. And if we don't, we start to feel really, really bad. So that is the game we're playing. And it can be drawn, graphically represented by a circle, because the whole thing does travel in a circle. We pick the viewpoint, and then our whole task, our whole game is to make everything agree with that viewpoint, which reaffirms the viewpoint and makes it seem to exist even more, which goes round and round and round. So that's all we do. That's all the self or ego ever does. It just reconfirms or revalidates its whole existence the whole time, and ignores everything that would disagree with that nice cozy picture. And the self isn't an entity, because if that circle were to be, that loop were to be interrupted, then that whole illusion of this is the right way to look at things would vanish in a second. So if we can understand this, we can understand the most vital or the most important thing about psychology, which is that the self is a tautological loop, a kind of a loop of logic that feeds on itself, but never gets anywhere by doing this. Okay, thanks for watching.